Data center rack densities have grown from 2.5 kilowatts per rack to upwards of 133 kilowatts per rack in the time I've been involved in the industry as an entrepreneur over the last 7 years. But this is not to say that 2.5 kilowatt racks have disappeared. So there's such an obsession with the 133 kilowatt rack, and the numbers keep getting implausibly bigger every single time I go to a conference. But that doesn't mean like the 5 kilowatt rack is gone. It's not, because your edge data center on the outskirts of Amsterdam that's supplying you your Netflix on demand is still using that 5 kilowatt rack to make that library available 2 miles from where you are. So I think as an operator, you have a couple of options. One is to figure out what part of that entire ecosystem you want to play in. And the answer is usually that I can only do one or two things. You can't be everything to everybody. So this sort of mad rush into everybody trying to build AI training data centers, no, it's a very specialized game. Like only a few players will succeed. Hi, it's Atif Ansar from Foresight, and you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And today I'm welcoming a very special guest. Joining me from Oxford in the UK is Dr. Atif Ansar, who's a fellow at Oxford Saïd Business School, as well as chairman and co-founder of Foresight. Atif, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be here, Joshua. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me as well. So when I think about data center go-to-market strategies, most people build these based on confidence and forecasts and a lot of activity metrics. But the research on megaprojects, and I know you've done a lot of work on megaprojects, suggests that those are exactly the conditions where failure is likely to be hiding the longest. So I'm really, really glad that you're joining me today so we can talk through how and why data centers are becoming these important mega projects in the world and why GTM thinking may not have caught up quite yet. So with that in mind, I first want to talk about why some of these forecasts around data center projects tend to fail. And what do you see as the leading indicators, kind of the early warning signs that these large projects are going to struggle to hit their targets?
Absolutely, Joshua. So I think we're in a very interesting position in the data center market. So the volume of construction has just skyrocketed, maybe 10 to 20x what it was in 2020. And I give such a broad range because there's so many announcements. It's hard to keep track of also what's really being built and what are megawatts versus bragawatts. It's hard to tell apart in this market. But predicated on all of that is massive demand for AI services, as well as basic data center cloud services. So Netflix, even this call, is living in some kind of a data center somewhere, and then all the synthetic data being generated, all the foundation model sort of videos, images, etc., they all have to live in data centers as well. So the demand is not the constraint of this boom, but execution of that data center is. So where the forecasts are going wrong is not in the demand profiling. People are finding the revenue once they build the data centers. And one of the unique features of the current data center boom is that the capacity is built under contract from customers, not speculatively. So unlike previous booms like telecom, where the capital supply was speculative, data centers are unique because they're contracted prior to getting built. So that's a really good thing. But the trouble is, once they're contracted, they're not coming in on time. And as a result, people have to pay very large penalties for the delays on those data centers, and they lose revenue for the duration of that delay as well. And these are generally 10 to 15 year fixed term contracts. So every revenue you miss because of a delay is lost forever. And if you know a little bit about how net present value gets calculated, the earliest revenue is the most valuable. So the delay forecast and the ability to execute the construction risk of projects is the single biggest constraint right now.
I understand too that there's a lot of different perspectives and bias that goes into how different stakeholders look at these mega projects. Do you have any thoughts on how optimism, how politics and different perspectives and bias plays into how people look at these projects?
Absolutely. So look, what we know from Nobel Prize winning research in psychology by namely Daniel Kahneman, as well as a huge set of other behavioral economists who've done work in this area, is that human beings are biased in our decision making. And that applies to even low stakes decisions. So by bias, I mean is that we tend to underestimate the time or cost it takes to get certain things done, even grabbing a coffee. So I might say to you, Joshua, hey, I'll be back from a coffee in 5 minutes. But if you really clock me, I might be back in 10 minutes, or it could take me 20 minutes or 5.5 hours. There isn't really a limit to how late I could be running from that estimate. So bias is the norm, it's not the exception. So we have to expect that when people project data centers to be built in 16 months or 20 months, there will be a degree of psychological optimism bias. On top of the psychological optimism bias is a problem of political bias. You mentioned politics yourself. And that's where, in order to secure the sale, people have to make bolder and bolder claims. So suddenly a 100 megawatt data center, which on average gets delivered around 24 months, people really want it done in 18 months, but they try and sell it at 11 months, which everyone knows is totally ridiculous, but they'll claim that anyway, and somehow, those commitments will get made, and that basically means delay gets baked in at the day that capacity is sold, unless one is super careful or figures out execution methodologies that are actually able to keep up with such bold claims.
So there's brilliant people working in this industry globally. Why do you find that really, really smart technologists and engineers and real estate developers, why do they completely keep falling for these wishful thinking forecasts?
So look, experts are not exempt from biases. One of the findings of psychological literature that we've confirmed in our work on major and mega projects as well is that sometimes being an expert actually reinforces bias. The idea comes from back in the day, there's a psychologist who designed a optical illusion that everybody's seen, Frank Muller-Lyer. And if you have two lines, one of them has arrows turned inward, the other one has arrows turned outwards. These lines look like they're different lengths, even though from past experience people know that they are the same length. The trouble is you could make that data up. And the only way to overcome biases or optical illusions like this is to measure them, is to use a foot ruler and be able to test whether or not that is accurate. So just because you've worked in an industry for 10, 20, or 30 years doesn't exempt you from bias. It may actually reinforce the bias. And the only way to overcome that is by being very open-minded and look at the data in a very cool-headed manner. I can tell you a little bit more about some of the research work I've done in it if this is an area you'll not explore together more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super, super fascinating about why people make decisions certain ways and how that perspective might be different from a data center operator, a hyperscaler, from a technology company, from an engineering company, from a real estate company.
Absolutely. So Joshua, a piece of work I did originally on US defense projects by looking at public disclosures of budgets and units procured and timelines of US defense projects. And that study replicates very well for data centers and other types of mega projects as well. So if you take two key metrics, which are revenue, like you talked about earlier on, and time, which is the time it takes to get to that revenue. And essentially, if you look at what was the estimated time during the construction period or development period of a project, and what was the actual time. So what they said against what they actually did. If you take a ratio of that, a ratio of 1 would mean that they came in on time. A ratio anything above 1 implies that they were delayed. So 2 would imply that you took double the time than you estimated. So for a data center, that means that it was sold for, say, 18 months, but it took 36 months to build that data center, so it ended up being a ratio of 2. On revenue, you've got essentially, say you wanted to generate $10 million worth of revenue per month. If you generated $20 million, that'd be a ratio of 2, so that's a good thing. But if you ended up with just $5 million per month, that would be a ratio of 0.5, to give you an example. If you put these two things on an axis, so revenue uplift or shortfall on the y-axis and time overrun or time shortfall on the x-axis, you get a scatter plot. And what you observe in the scatter plot is that quite a few projects land in the disaster zone, which is they're really late and they miss their revenue forecast. So they produce less revenue than that was estimated. That's a value destroying, potentially bankruptcy inducing asset. That is about 30% of the assets in the industry that are being built right now. But another 20% of the assets are in the happy quadrant, which is in the top left-hand corner, which is they're producing a lot more revenue than was originally forecasted, and they got built much more quickly than was originally estimated. So I did sort of a variance analysis of the good versus the bad projects. And what I learned was something very, very interesting, both looking at quantitative data, but then also interviewing the people who had built these projects across the industry. And there's sort of two dimensions that I came up with in my work. One is simply their mental orientation. Are they open-minded as a person? Do they scan the environment for new ideas, or are they closed-minded as a person? Do they just believe, I'm an expert, I've done this for 30 years, leave me alone, get out of here, type of a person. So, and you sort of see both personality types in any given industry. And on the x-axis is simply their expectations about the future. It's how they've read the data, and they're realistic people who look at the evidence and they make realistic forecasts. And the magical people out there, and magical people, essentially think that something that takes 20 months to get done is going to get done in 2 months. That's almost defies any rational expectation. Or for example, if it takes 6 hours to fly from New York to California, they may insist that they can get there in 1 hour. Everybody knows it's not possible in current technology, but they may insist that anyway. So what we discovered is that disaster zone is when people are closed-minded and magical in their thinking. Because it becomes almost impossible to correct their view. And unfortunately, the world of project construction has quite a lot of people like that, who live in a bunker, don't want to listen to the outside world, and have these really ambitious, bordering on unachievable ideas about the cost and time it takes to get projects done. So that's not somewhere you want to be. And the happy quadrant are people who are open-minded, but realistic. So they're scanning the environment for new ideas, they're talking to the outside world, they're constantly revising their own estimates, and at the same time, they're realistic of how hard it is to deliver projects and how easily they go off rails if you're not constantly leading them every single day. That's where you get clear winners. That realism and open-mindedness is what we call cognitive maturity. And that's what I like to see when I talk to executives is really just get a quick sense of, what's their cognitive maturity orientation. Are they living in la-la land of project delivery, or have they sort of both crunched the numbers, but listening to people? And they're ambitious as well. It's not to say realism doesn't mean diluted ambition. It means that you are approaching it with open-mindedness, but with knowledge of what you can achieve in 1 year type of thing.
We go through a version of that cognitive maturity, or I guess the opposite, cognitive immaturity, with a lot of stakeholders all the time, where we have these conversations of, look, all the research suggests that your addressable market, your ideal clients, your buyer personas, they want a lot more self-service. They want to spend a lot less time talking to your sales team, and yet they're still selling as if it's 10 years ago. So yeah, we can relate to that a lot. But one of the other big areas that's directly related to this is now the public perception of these mega projects and narrative. In particular, when I think about some of my colleagues in the UK and various parts of the data center industry, they've gotten upset in the last 6 months to a year that they feel like mainstream publications are picking on them and that they don't have all the information. So when we think about like narrative and these mega projects, whether they went well or they didn't, is there a certain amount of like survivorship bias, or there's a certain amount of false success narratives? Like, when you look at all of that, what are the best practices lean towards focusing on?
Great question, Joshua. So I think doing a really disciplined project, and then second is communicating it really well. So, give you one example. One of the CEOs of a large developer was talking about this at PTC in Hawaii recently, and what he said was absolutely brilliant, which is some of the data centers they've built in communities are creating a huge number of jobs, but they're also investing as part of their social commitment into local schools and kind of community education initiatives. The data center itself generates about $20 million of incremental tax for that particular county. But people don't necessarily think about numbers. That's the evidence. So part of that is collecting that evidence and making sure you have it. The second piece is the communication. Just telling a community that they're going to earn another 20 million in tax is very abstract, and voters don't really resonate with that. But saying, hey, that buys you, 17 teachers in your local community school suddenly makes sense. And the idea is if you love teachers, you love data centers. And suddenly you can sort of translate that meaningful but abstract evidence into something that actually also resonates with communities. So I think what best data center developers are doing is doing the hard discipline work of actually engaging with the communities, engaging with the local politicians, understanding the pain points they have, but then they're also spending a lot of time in communication, that translates those metrics into something an average voter can understand.
The irony as well with the data center developers being in a position to fill up the tax coffers for the local communities to allow them to build new schools and hire better teachers is K-12 and higher education. Everyone's thinking about how to reinvent to future-proof and prepare people for next generation careers. And if you think of the model that Apple and Microsoft and Google and AWS have used to create these career curriculums, it seems to me, being Gen X and having kids that are like at the end of high school into college and everything, is there a role in the data center industry helping to not only pay for these communities to build the school, but help influence curriculum going forward? Because if you look back 100 years ago, that's why schools were built, right? Commercial interests.
Look, absolutely. So I think that is going on at like an unprecedented scale at the moment, right? So, from free courses that all of these big companies release, even Foresight's working on a course on project management data centers, purely as a way of giving back to community, and from Coursera to, all kinds of platforms where you can achieve them. So I think that people should definitely, from even YouTube videos, or you could ask ChatGPT to kind of give you a training course. I think that that is going on, but also the economic incentives it creates. So tech jobs pay quite a lot. People are familiar with it. That market pull, I think, has a tremendous impact on getting people excited about educating themselves. How you make sure that that's completely inclusive, I haven't fully worked that out, but I do think this is creating just a huge opportunity for people who are plugged in and understand where this whole revolution is going.
And what I keep talking with people about constantly is if your salespeople are having a much more difficult time getting that initial meeting, you still have a way of being able to influence the purchase decision. Just meet them where they are, be in the professional development, be in the learning development business. It's the new early generation, lead generation. It's the new top of the funnel.
Absolutely. There's nothing like education-based marketing, right? We know that. And I mean, I think some of it is simply craft, right? So is understanding the craft of the go-to-market craft, but also ultimately you have to add value to people you're talking to for them to want to buy from you.
So it seems like with all the research, all the work you've done around studying a lot of these failures in mega projects, that a lot more of the failures are predictable than people want to own up to?
100%. That's, if we were to summarize this podcast, this failure is way more predictable. People pretend as if some piece of bad luck has happened to them. No, we could have told them that before they got started. If they just provide for it and think it through, they would not have encountered that catastrophe.
Why do so few people see data centers as mega projects? I heard a few minutes of a talk you gave a few years back where you were talking about the Hoover Dam project in the US, where for anyone that's ever taken a US history course, or especially people that live in the southwestern part of the US, they consider it a massive, massive project, and they may not be connecting the dots on the long-term impact. Why are people so resistant to thinking of data center infrastructure as mega projects?
I think it's where the form has confused people into thinking that data centers are somehow just warehouses. There's a common myth that even very experienced, very senior people keep repeating is somehow data centers are simple projects. They're not. People think they're like cold distribution centers or warehouses for groceries. Couldn't be farther from the truth. They're closer to an old refinery than they are to a warehouse. And part of that is that when data centers were very little and kind of like a niche area 15, 20 years ago, they were part of real estate portfolios, but now they've evolved to becoming, something akin to an oil and gas asset, and potentially even more capital intensive. To give you an example, a 100 megawatt data center is roughly $10 to $18 million per megawatt, depending on the entire spec that you use, just to get it to be, the land, the core and shell, the mechanical and electrical systems, the cooling systems, the redundancy around the power, etc. And then when you put the compute in, that's 2 to 3 times that value. So a 100 megawatt data center is a minimum of $3 billion of total investment across multiple participants, and can be as high as $6 to $8 billion. And the definition of a mega project, as a heuristic definition at Oxford, is simply anything above $1 billion. So these are like mega projects.
Yeah, I think the speed of change has really taken a lot of people off guard. When I first started working in this space in the early 2010s, we'd work for a lot of small co-location operators, and these were companies with a couple dozen employees that were doing a few million a year in revenue, trying to get to 10, 20, 30 million a year in revenue, and most of them exited and got acquired by bigger companies. Someone now with those kinds of limited resources is for sure not building their own co-location facility.
100%. And look, many of these tech companies were formerly startups, right? And they keep referring to themselves as startups, even though they are $4 trillion companies. They are 8 to 10 times more valuable than some of the biggest oil and gas companies out there. So I think part of it is simply just thinking these are some of the most complex industrial assets out there in the world. We just need to think about them that way and give and kind of notch up our skill set to match the true scale and complexity of these assets.
To this day, when I talk about go-to-market strategy with founders and CEOs and sales leaders and product leaders, marketing leaders, they tend to think in terms of total addressable market, TAM. They think in terms of ideal client profiles. They think in terms of conferences, but they're not thinking about mega projects, and they're not thinking about it through the same lens as you are. What insights would you provide to those folks when they're talking about how to predict some of these GTM challenges and failures through the lens that you look at the industry?
So I think the GTM challenges, Joshua, so do you mean by people who sell data center capacity, or people who sell software to data center builders, or kind of OEM type of products to data center builders?
It's kind of all of the above. We segment the industry into operators like hyperscale, edge, and colocation providers. There's a couple dozen different kinds of technology companies. There's a couple dozen different kinds of facilities-related companies. We put construction, real estate, and investment into their own entity, and we put outsourced sales and marketing companies into their own entity. So typically most of these companies that are struggling are either operators, or they sell something technology or facilities related that goes inside or on the exterior of a data center, or in some cases they build data centers.
Absolutely. So I think, Josh, to answer your question, I think it really helps to have very good data. Well, first of all, knowing who you are as a company, and then knowing a little bit about your customer as well. So in terms of Foresight, we are a software provider for owners of data centers. That basically means colo providers as well as sort of developers as well. We have some hyperscale relationships, but we don't sell directly to hyperscalers ourselves. We sell to the leaseholders, sort of the colo developers, who then lease them out to hyperscalers. So I think part of, like you mentioned, you've got to understand your ICP and segment the market accordingly, and then understand very specifically what is the diagnostic on that particular customer profile. So for an operator, that may be relatively large. Are they building new assets? Where are they building them? What's the total size? What's the team maturity level right now? What is their process right now? So on and so forth. all of that mapping, which requires quite a lot of work up front, but then becomes second nature for your go-to-market colleagues, becomes invaluable to understand where's the sale opportunity with them, and then identifying really quickly within mega project space. Right now people are thinking very, very carefully about design, partly because the design aspect of these mega projects, data center mega projects, is completely thrown up in the air because of the switch from air cooling to liquid cooling, and because of just the heat intensity and density of new chips. It requires constantly rethinking new ways of optimizing the cooling dimension of these data centers, which then has an impact on the workloads and how the compute works as well. So I think lots of opportunities for entrepreneurs, both in physical hardware as well as the design aspects, and then software that can help optimize these data centers as well. Happy to expand on any of these ideas.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
What's interesting too is I see a lot of people looking to Nvidia and specifically trying to predict what Jensen Huang is going to announce next as a barometer for where they should make their investments. And especially with being a publicly held company, these announcements are typically thought of in terms of weeks or months, at least the pace of change. Yet a lot of the conference ecosystem plans with a 12-month time horizon. So reconciling the short term, the intermediate term, the long term, I imagine, is challenging for startups as well.
It is, and I think in general, people have to make one big strategic decision, which is what part of the market are they going to play in and what they're going to ignore. So even retail, data center rack densities have grown from 2.5 kilowatts per rack to upwards of 133 kilowatts per rack in the time I've been involved in the industry as an entrepreneur, over the last 7 years. But this is not to say that 2.5 kilowatt racks have disappeared. So there's such an obsession with the 133 kilowatt rack, and the numbers keep getting implausibly bigger every single time I go to a conference. But that doesn't mean like the 5 kilowatt rack is gone. It's not. Because your edge data center on the outskirts of Amsterdam that's supplying you your Netflix on demand is still using that 5 kilowatt rack to make that library available 2 miles from where you are. So I think as an operator, you have a couple of options. One is to figure out what part of that entire ecosystem you want to play in. And the answer is usually that I can only do one or two things. You can't be everything to everybody. So this sort of mad rush into everybody trying to build AI training data centers. No, it's a very specialized game. Like only a few players will succeed. And just because you've been very successful in building cloud storage oriented data centers doesn't mean that you can do AI training data centers. It's literally like somebody who's never done, North Pole drilling suddenly wants to start doing like deep sea North Pole drilling. Like, not going to work out. I'm going to stick to what you know.
Operating the petrol station in the
exactly.
town, yeah.
Like if you operate a petrol station and suddenly you want to go do like deep sea drilling, like it's going to be a very, very. It's not to say you can't do it ever, but it's just going to be a very steep learning curve. And people who do deep sea drilling should continue doing that. It'd be very hard to suddenly switch models altogether. So I think part of that is simply understanding where your capability sets lies inside the market right now, and then sticking close to it. And the second part, second part, which applies to much bigger companies that are multi-capability companies, because there's quite a few really big players that do have very strong competencies across multiple market segments. That's where they have to think about flexibility. So I think one thing that's certainly going to happen with data centers is you're going to see a big mix of chips within the same under the same roof. So you might have classical CPUs against multiple different types of GPUs, and even quantum chips, inferencing chips like LPUs that people are coming up with, like Grok has, for example, all of them housed under one roof, orchestrating the workloads depending on the customer type. But that sort of very flexible, very sophisticated play is for the multi-capability players, not your average startup.
With so much of the industry being ecosystem focused, with people constantly trying to figure out their segmentation strategy and where they spend the time, do you see certain kind of vendor incentives shaping behaviors that could be good for one party, but not necessarily in the best interest of the other party?
Very good question. I'm not sure I've got an immediate response. I mean, I think I'm not sure how sophisticated players are across the board. They pretend to be, but I'm curious to learn more on whether they are really collecting the data and thinking in such a granular manner.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective as well, and it gets back to that the quadrants and the cognitive savants versus the people combining their not the opposite of humility.
I often say, like this in data center industry, you've got the numerical people, which is the cognitive mature companies, and then the cowboys. And I don't think the cowboys necessarily collect that kind of fine-grained data. So it's not to say the cowboys don't make money, but it's sort of feast or famine, and it comes with a lot of insolvency risk.
Speaking of insolvency risk, one of the unique attributes of a company that's so capital intensive is so much of what catapults someone from startup to scale up and scale up to next level is venture capital and private equity. And they have their own set of expectations on timelines, but so much of digital infrastructure, so much of these mega projects have really long sales cycles. How do those two competing forces come together without the two parties driving each other nuts?
So look, I think the private equity dimension is a hugely positive impact on the data center industry. It's basically taken what was a cottage industry 20 years ago, and kind of like a pioneers industry, if you will, 15, 20 years ago, to something that's becoming much more professionalized and much more disciplined. So Blackstone, BlackRock, KKR, coming into the market, MGX, I think is a hugely positive discipline force. And part of this is that they are bringing that numerical approach into an industry that has tended towards being a bit cowboy. So I think this creative tension that you mentioned is exactly right. And very timely for the data center industry, particularly is really stepping up a level right now to learn as much as they can from their investors and their approach. I think there will be a few difficult moments because the private equity investors don't necessarily understand the data center industry or the technology cycle as well, and hardcore data center people don't necessarily understand the private equity way of thinking. So there'll certainly be a degree of kind of mutual maturity and learning that will have to happen. But I think the match is an incredible one over the long term, and will only help to increase the rigor with which data centers are built and executed.
One of the challenges is at the same time as when you get a capital infusion, as a founder, usually you're looking to deploy that capital into hiring. And one of the additional scaling up strategies that tends to happen is it allows the companies to take big steps forward in getting on bigger and bigger stages at national and global conferences. They can graduate from just going to local meetups and local technology events and hosting their own events to increasingly having a bigger footprint. But the question is, how do you manage expectations around making the right bets, getting the right return on investment, efficient capital deployment, when there's so much fragmentation and so much rapid evolution of this industry?
Absolutely. So I think I would say a few pieces of kind of few tips come to mind. One is we have to grow the entire labor pool dedicated towards data centers. So right now there's a huge poaching warfare going on where people are just poaching people from each other, and that doesn't really help at the end of the day. Even really good people will be very effective wherever they go, but as an industry overall, we need to increase the number of people. So I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the construction volume in data centers has grown 10 to 20x. The labor pool, skilled and unskilled workers, has not. The supply chain is not 10 to 20x bigger now than it was 5 years ago. So we do need to kind of broadly educate the market, to your point, from young graduates to people switching careers from other industries into data centers. I think a second point is really understanding or setting a standard for the sort of people you want. So, and that's sort of kind of a core cultural North Star for each company, and that can accommodate many different bets on what's ultimately going to fit with their customer segments. That's kind of matching your internal vision or internal culture as a company with those of your customers. And I think the industry is big enough and varied enough that there is something for everybody here. What I don't see a lot of companies doing is really being clear about what is it that they believe in, and as a result, who are the sort of people that they want to sell to, that will be on the same wavelength.
What I find fascinating as well is it's essentially two different pipelines that both have their own unique challenges, and a lot of people in the data center industry completely outsource the talent acquisition to other parties to try to figure out how to engage in that behavior that you were mentioning, where they look to their competitors and look poach away. But essentially it's another CRM, it's another set of personas, it's another kind of education, it's another kind of pipeline, it's another kind of alignment. That's part of the reason why for a long time we've considered recruiters part of outsourced sales and marketing in this industry, because it's taking the place of what should be employer marketing.
Absolutely. And look, people who've succeeded in one role may not necessarily succeed in a different role. So people who've sold like $1 million deals, may or may not be able to sell $10 million deals. And I don't think necessarily people screen for that as effectively. So skills are much more bounded than people often imagine them to be. So yes, that should be part of the conversation. But I think all of that starts with setting your internal standard of what sort of people you want to attract, and what sort of customer you want to sell to.
One of the GTM failures and challenges that really fascinates us is the emergence of this enormous conference ecosystem. We're seeing some estimates upwards of almost $500 million a year being spent on the global data center conference industry. And you end up with, in many cases, people that are going to, on average, 2 events a month with a day of travel on each side, a couple of days preparing before you go and promoting it a couple of days when you recap. So you add all this up, and like 42, 45, 48 weeks of the year, they're at conferences. When do they do their real job? Or is this something that they're emulating, a big company that can afford to have a full-time conference evangelist when you're a Fortune 1000 company with tens of thousands of employees, and the company with 30 employees or 150 employees should not be trying to
Well, look, I think, Gandhi, you have to. So I had a professor at Georgetown where I did my undergraduate, Professor Elaine Romanelli, and I went to her as a sophomore. Very, very distinctly remember this particular meeting with her. And I said, look, I really want to get into, I'm fascinated with the world of infrastructure and construction. As an economics major, I was already very fascinated by this. And I was like, how do I get into this? And the first thing she said was like, go to conferences, go to trade shows. And the second thing she said was read trade magazines. Podcast didn't exist back then, but I'm sure she would add trade podcasts as part of that armory as well. And that's exactly what I did as a sophomore. I booked a ticket to go to a conference in Las Vegas. It was my first construction conference. In retrospect, it was completely irrelevant, but it got me started and got me thinking, got me the first few contacts. So I'm hugely in favor of the conference ecosystem. Obviously, as a company, you have to be careful of how you manage your resource around it, but definitely for people looking to enter the industry, looking to clue up about the industry, I think going to trade shows is a remarkable way to build those relationships and kind of get a head start.
What's super interesting about that as well is being at Georgetown, like right in the back door, right just north of Northern Virginia and Data Center Alley. You have Northern Virginia community that's got one of the few formal data center programs in the entire country. But can you imagine how awesome it would be if a major Ivy League university were to all of a sudden offer a master's degree or PhD in data center management or data center
operations? Very happy to design one for them. If Georgetown were to come and ask me, I'd be delighted to help.
That seems like one of the huge global scarcity items that keeps coming back. Because like I mentioned before, probably in the history of this podcast, I've had easily a dozen people on now that have ties either on a full-time or part-time basis to teaching at a major university. So yeah, definitely one of the gaps that I envision will start to close in the coming years, just out of necessity.
Absolutely. I think University of Virginia or Georgetown should listen into that.
So what do you, with all of this in mind, what do you think smarter, more deliberate, more intentional go-to-market looks like for different size companies within the data center industry?
So I think, like, to repeat myself here, Joshua, it's like figure out what is it that you are, and more importantly, what is that what you are not. So I think a lot of companies spend too much time dreaming up these super horizontal generalist strategies, and I don't believe in them. I believe in extremely narrow segmentation, both of your own skill set as well as customer segmentation. So my suggestion would be, really cull your target account list to as few targets as possible rather than as many as possible, which is what many of the go-to-market strategies zero in on, and then figure out how do you create a match between your culture, your vision, your orientation to your customers, and that's the way to be able to create value for them and get sticky, in very, very narrow segments and go deeper rather than spamming thousands of people.
It reminds me of the idea that's talked about with a lot of SaaS founders that more startups die of gluttony than starvation. They take on way too many ideas at once, spread themselves way too thin.
There's another sort of, which is you're much more likely to die of suicide than murder as a startup. So, so I think they worry too much about their competitors and not enough about their core customers.
So especially early on, as putting on your hat as co-founder and chair of Foresight, what do you see as better GTM signals than just purely looking at the pipeline dashboard?
I think fandom, when users go, wow, this is like a new pair of glasses. I'm seeing the world in color for the first time. That's when you have to reinforce that particular motion.
Are there certain steps that you think people are tackling in the wrong order, where they're getting ahead of themselves? Does sequencing play a really big role in this growth as opposed to just trying to grow as fast as possible at all costs?
I think, it's the tendency to spam before really doing the analysis around who the relevant customers are, and more importantly, like who you are yourself. I think that's the gap in the sequencing. So it's like really understanding one's own core as a company, and then understanding the customers that best match it before going out and triggering conversations.
Yeah, you brought up a really interesting practical challenge for so many companies that are focused on short-term activity metrics. You have your ideal client profile, you've defined a narrow list of targeted accounts. Now just hammer them with outbound and book meetings because everyone wants to talk to sales this week.
That's it. And there's a whole art form to selling, which you just have to learn the craft. Like, it's hard to teach it over a 30-minute podcast, but there's very, very poor ways of selling, and then there's some very, very good ways of selling. And there's a great sort of quote by one of the authors, and he said, look, everything I'm about to tell you, you will agree with, and you will tell me how effective it is, and you will not do it. Because doing it requires discipline and pig-headed, like, doggedness, that most people do it for one day and then they give up the following. And there's just no substitute for that execution.
I see, especially for a lot of smaller companies, this is such a big culture change from how they traditionally are training to be account executives and sales development reps. A lot of it is education and trust building, which requires an intermediate mindset. It requires, in most cases, upskilling and reskilling some people that may not be as technically strong as the prospects and clients that they're selling to. Or in some cases, I see a lot of companies that are hiring career IT professionals and career engineers who've never sold in their life to be on these teams because they know they'll at least have really strong credibility and rapport with the prospects and clients.
Well, see, the thing, so I completely agree with that. So, Daniel Pink wrote this amazing book called To Sell is Human. And the basic idea is all of us are salespeople, irrespective of whatever job you're in, because selling is part of being human. But what we forget is that we often fixate on this idea of we're selling. We're not selling. We're just giving people the information and the education for them to buy, to make informed buying decisions. And you're purely facilitating that process. We're helping. And the answer may be your company is not the one they need to buy, and that's okay, because the job is not to shove ill-conceived solutions down people's throats, but it's to help them find the best value. And that collateral way of selling inevitably raises all boats. And I think that's where the craft piece is super important. I think rapport, etc., is actually less important than education, and really instigating a new idea in people's mind, and letting it see how it grows, and then giving them the space and time to integrate that into their thinking, and they come back and buy when they're ready.
All about trust, educating and building trust and staying with them throughout that long journey.
And that trust and that education piece is not like not necessarily a smooth process. It will challenge them. It will take them outside their comfort zone, and not a lot of A's are comfortable doing that because they feel like they're breaking rapport. It's a very fine balance between, you don't need amazing rapport, but you don't want to break rapport.
I see a lot of people too getting thrown really for a loop when they realize just how many different stakeholders need to get involved on that decision committee. And great, okay, they have an internal champion, but does that internal champion really have enough political capital? Are they armed with the right tools and narrative and everything to help you spread this potentially transformative idea?
Absolutely, because companies are also satisficing, right? Like if they are good enough, in a good enough place, there's got to be a very compelling reason to change. Otherwise, the cost of change and the emotional pain of change is, if that exceeds the benefit, they wouldn't do it, irrespective of the financial metrics.
Atif, final area I wanted to ask you about today is, if you, as a GTM leader, if you could fix just one thing tomorrow, what is it?
For one thing in what area?
in your go-to-market approach.
Foresight's go-to-market approach, or how people are going about the go-to-market approach?
What you observe, where you're just rolling your eyes, that if you were brought in to do a radical makeover on that company in a couple of days, a couple hours, a couple of weeks, what is the very first thing that you'd start with making over their approach to dramatically increase their chances of success?
So I think it's to move away from activity to outcome. So a lot of people think, oh, I've sent 1,000 emails today, I've done my job. That's not selling. If you have one really serious conversation that provides that real outcome to customers, and ultimately encourages them to buy from you, that's far more valuable than spending your entire day sending thousands of emails. So I think there's this input fixation in a lot of GTM teams when what they need is an outcome fixation.
Chasing the vanity metrics.
Chasing the vanity metrics, exactly.
I'm in a room with thousands of people, so magical things will happen. Absolutely,
exactly. Just because that's it. I'm sat in a conference room with thousands of people, somehow I'm going to generate revenue out of it. That's magical thinking. Or I've got a massive like HubSpot automation that's going to somehow bring me revenue. That's magical thinking.
We used to see that as well in the HubSpot ecosystem 10, 15 years ago, where people were like, I signed up for the portal. Where are the clients?
Exactly. So, there's and I'm mainly repeating good practice that is out in the market. This is not necessarily stuff I've invented, but it's, sales and go-to-market is about having meaningful conversations. It's not about just overwhelming people and annoying the hell out of them through ill-conceived messaging.
In order to transform people, they have to trust you.
Absolutely. And in some ways, like being an educator, I feel like the transition to a GTM leader was very smooth because I just continue to teach just to larger audiences.
I think the future, and SAS has been talking about this for almost 10 years already. I think the future of being an enterprise account executive looks a lot more like being a teacher, consultant, subject matter expert, trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader, a lot more like a big four consultant than most people want to realize how much the world has changed in terms of earning their way back in these early stage conversations, when the default that everyone goes to try to figure things out is you're now in competition with ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini, with people figuring things out on their own.
And I think it's much more like tough love, like sports coaching, than sycophancy, which is what like a lot of GTM people think, that if I'm nice enough to people, somehow they'll buy from me. They won't. It's about, like you said, coaching them like as if they were an elite athlete and you were helping them, or even if they're not an elite athlete but have aspirations to become an elite athlete, helping them close the gap between where they are and where they want to be.
I spend a lot of time talking with people about their expectations around the cabana party, the golf tournament, taking people to the World Series or to the Super Bowl or some other lavish experience. I'm like, did you really get to educate and build trust with them there? Because I can tell you, if you took out the workbook and the methodologies and the PowerPoint slides to try to teach them something on the golf course, you're not going to be a very popular host.
No, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is the challenge with pulling all of this together. But yeah, it has been really, really fascinating to look at this through two lenses, both through the lens of mega projects and why mega projects succeed and why mega projects fail, and the different biases that people bring to the table, and how you're applying this with growing your own software startup designed to help data center projects be more successful.
Thank you, Josh. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise. Atif, if someone wants to reach out to you or follow what you're working on, is LinkedIn the best place to start?
LinkedIn. You can also have my email address. It's simply AA, my initials, at foresight.works. Would love to hear from you.
And is the best place for someone to learn more about Foresight the LinkedIn page and website?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, cool. We'll include links to both of those as well with the episode. I've been speaking today with Dr. Atif Ansar, who is the chair and co-founder of Foresight Works, as well as a fellow at the Oxford Saïd Business School in the UK. Atif, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.